Thank you very much, and thank you for arranging this fine visit here to Williams. I've had the great pleasure of being in a bunch of classes and getting to meet a bunch of students. And thank you all for coming tonight. Now, I was very impressed when they told me that this evening had sold out. And then someone made the mistake of showing me one of the tickets, and it said cost $0.00. So it's sort of a different definition of sold out, you know. But really it's about pretty much precisely what I'm worth, I'm afraid, as a speaker, especially since, and I always feel this hard when I'm surrounded by people I like, and I'm always aware that my basic role in life is to be a professional bummer-outer of people. And I apologize for that in advance. And I promise that we'll get to some more hopeful stuff toward the end. But we are going to go through the valley first for a minute. Because we're dealing with the most important thing that humans have ever dealt with. And it makes sense to be pretty much on the same page, to understand what's going on in the world around us, because the depth of that crisis informs what the possible responses are. So, I wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience 22 years ago in 1989, i.e. before many of you were born, okay? That's how long we've known about climate change as a public. And we knew 22 years ago most of what we needed to know. We know that when you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The basics are easy. The only thing we did not know 22 years ago was how fast and how hard this would pinch. And the story of the last 22 years is that it is pinching harder and faster than we would have thought, okay? Part of the reason for that is that scientists, by their nature, are conservative and cautious and underestimate rather than overestimate. The other part of it is we did not understand, because this was a new experiment, how finely balanced the planet really was. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth 1 degree. There's about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface, which really isn't that much. It's less than one of those small white Christmas tree lights per square meter of the Earth's surface. But it turns out that that's been enough to cause enormous change. It's been enough to propel us out of the Holocene, out of that 10,000 years of benign climatic stability that have underwritten the rise of civilization, and into something very new. That's really what this last book of mine, Earth with the extra A, you kind of have to channel your inner Schwarzenegger to pronounce it correctly, sort of Earth. The conceit of the title was that the planet had changed enough already that it deserved at least a little bit of a new name. I mean, you know, still same number of continents, gravity still works, but in profound ways, different. You know, the oceans are 30% more acid than there were 30 years ago, because the chemistry of seawater is changing as they absorb CO2. And it was your own Betsy Colbert who was really the first to bring that to everybody's attention in a big way, in one of her wonderful articles in the New Yorker. The cryosphere, the frozen portions of the Earth's surface, are changing in very profound and dramatic ways. Those pictures, everything's melting. You remember, I see that there are some in here like me old enough to remember when those first pictures came back from Apollo 8 of our, you know, beautiful blue-white marble floating in the black void of space, you know, And those were beautiful pictures, and they're now as out of date as my high school yearbook picture is, you know, except for the opposite reason. In the case of the planet, there's a lot less white up top than there used to be. The summertime Arctic has about 40% less ice, okay? I could go on adducing these sort of statistics for a long time, and I'm not going to bother. I just want to talk to you about what's happened since that book came out, maybe 18 months ago, because it's more than adequate to explain where we are. 2010 was the warmest year for which we have records on this planet. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records last year, itself a record, and some of them were appalling. And we were on the phone one day, a year ago, July, with our 350.org crew in Pakistan. And one of them was, we were just talking about other stuff on the phone about organizing. One of them said, "It's hot here today." And I was very surprised to hear him say that, because in July in Pakistan it's always hot and you wouldn't think to remark on it. And he said, "No, it's really hot. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record today. It's 129 degrees here." I'm like, okay, that is indeed hot. You know, where I live in the mountains, Vermont, it might start to approach 100 degrees 1 or 2 days a year. Never quite gets there, but even approaching it is enough to cause an outbreak of bitching and moaning, you know, among all of us who live there. Add 30 degrees to that, and then for 98% of Pakistanis, subtract any air conditioning, and you've got some sense of what it's like. When you put heat like that into systems, things start to happen. Last year, and then again this year, the Arctic melted so ferociously that both the northwest and northeast passages were simultaneously open. There was a yacht race this year around territory that even 10 years ago no one thought any human being would ever be able to navigate. It would be permanently frozen. Maybe more powerfully, beginning last year, we really began to sense what global warming in its early stages does to hydrology, to the way that water moves around the planet. If you want one physical fact to bear in mind to understand this century, it's going to be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does, okay? The atmosphere is about 4% moister than it was 40 years ago on average. That is an astonishing change in a basic physical parameter of the planet. It's a number that hadn't really budged for 10,000 years, and now it has, okay? What that means is that in arid areas, you get more evaporation. That's what's producing that water. You get more drought as a result. Last summer, 2010, it was Russia that really experienced this. It never reached 100 degrees in Moscow before. It was above 100 degrees for 6 days in the beginning of August, part of this incredible heat wave and drought. And among other things, what happened was that a spooked Kremlin stopped all grain export to the rest of the planet. They turned around ships and train cars because they're worried about their harvest. And when that happened, since Russia in a normal year is the third biggest grain exporter on the planet, the price of wheat and corn went up about 70%. And when that happened, it meant that all kinds of people all over the world had a lot less to eat than they wanted to. The price of corn goes up here, you know, I mean, a box of cornflakes, you pay more for the box than for the corn, so it's not the end of the world. But if you go out every day to the market and buy cornmeal to make tortillas for your family for dinner, a 70% increase in the price of corn is a big deal. The number of malnourished people on this earth has been going steadily up the last few years after a long period of decline. That price of wheat and corn have stayed that high ever since because we've had one crop failure after another in place after place around the globe. In parts of Western Europe, in China, in parts of Australia. Now, the drought, of course, is most intense in the Horn of Africa, where lots of people are dying, and in the American Southwest, where we have never seen anything like it. They've now certified the drought in Texas as deeper and starker than the Dust Bowl years. Texas this summer set the record for the hottest summer in any American state, and they set the record by 1.8 degrees. Not by, you know, a 0.1% or something, by an astonishing amount. And one of the things that's happening is it's gotten so dry there. There are big parts of Texas where there hasn't been appreciable rainfall in a year that the sun dissipates none of its energy evaporating water into the atmosphere because there's no water to evaporate. It just is baking everything, and that's why it's getting so hot. Once that water's up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down. Water vapor, on average, stays in the atmosphere less than a week, okay? So we've loaded the dice for deluge and downpour and flood, and one place after another is throwing snake eyes now. So last summer, it was Pakistan. Beginning of August 2010, there's an area up in the Khyber Pass that normally gets about 3 feet of rain in a year, and the monsoon kind of stalled up there, and they got 12 feet of rain in a week, okay? And that was enough to cause the Indus to swell to the point where a quarter of the country was underwater. That's astonishing, just astonishing. 20 million people out of their homes. Ever since, we've been having one epic flood after another. You'll remember the pictures from Queensland in Christmas time. Quite staggering. Floods like no one had ever seen. And of course, there were lots of other places without TV cameras where the same sort of thing's been going on. Vietnam, the Philippines, parts of Sri Lanka, parts of Brazil, northeast of Rio, just amazing flooding, and we've seen it on this continent most powerfully in the last 6 months. Look what happened in the Mississippi and Missouri river basins this spring. More water came down those rivers than has ever come down them before. That's because they had record snowpacks from the winter. Record snowpack is what you get when you have record rainfall, but it's below 32 degrees, okay? And then they had record rains this spring as that snow was melting. And it was more water than anyone had ever seen. And of course, we've gotten to experience it in this part of the world in the last little while. When Irene came tearing up the coast, it encountered warmer water than ever has been measured off the New York and New Jersey coasts. It was the warmest seawater ever. And it allowed that storm to just pick up moisture like a sponge and carry it inland, and it just happened to drop it mostly over the Adirondacks and Vermont. It dropped more rain than we'd ever seen there. Mendon broke its old one-day rainfall record by 2 inches, okay? And you can tell that it was unprecedented rain because all you had to do was look at those pictures of covered bridges, one after another, washing down streams. Those things had been there, many of them 150 years, 200 years. They stood in a Vermont that was 20% forest, you know, mostly fields that couldn't hold water at all. Vermont's now 80% forest. It should be able to hold anything you throw at it, but that rain is falling on a different planet than those bridges were built on, than that forest grew up on. There's simply too much of it. A week later, the next set of tropical storms, Katia and Lee, kind of tailed up through the mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania and into the southern tier of New York. Binghamton set a new all-time rainfall record, okay? Binghamton has been keeping records for 100 and some years of its rainfall, so that's a lot of days and a lot of rainstorms. And if you statisticians among you will know that if you set a new record after that many instances, it should be a record by 1/10 of an inch or something like that. You know, we should have seen everything. They set a new one-day rainfall record that was 60% higher than the old one, okay? On a different world, on a different planet, that rain is falling. I could go on like this a long time, and I won't do it. I want to make 2 points before we're sort of done the real grimness here. One of them is, this is not just a great practical challenge, it's a great ethical challenge, all right? Because the idea that humans have caused this to happen is true, but not all humans. A fairly small subset of us who've been busily burning fossil fuel for the last 100 years are the cause of it. I kind of first understood that when I went to Bangladesh some years ago. Bangladesh, incredibly beautiful country, quite crowded, 140 million people in an area the size of Wisconsin, so very crowded, but they feed themselves. It's so fertile. It's where the great sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come pouring out of the Himalaya into the Bay of Bengal. Magnificent place. In long-term trouble because the Bay of Bengal, like all oceans, is rising and because the glaciers at the head of these rivers are dwindling. But when I was there, the problem they were having was acute, not chronic. The first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease now spreading like wildfire around Asia and South America because, frankly, mosquitoes really like the warm, wet world that we're building for them. If you were watching this planet from a distance through a telescope trying to figure out what on earth we were doing, a reasonable hypothesis would be that we'd gone in for sort of planet-scale mosquito ranching, you know, because that's what we're kind of doing right now. When I was there, they're having this big outbreak, and everybody was freaked out about it because it had never happened before, and there were big pictures on the front of the newspaper of this mosquito, Aedes aegypti, that spreads dengue and things. And I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito, and I got sick. And I remember going to the clinic in Dhaka, the ward of the hospital. There's really no treatment for it, but that's, you know, people were sort of showing up there. It was bigger than this room, and there were people just on cots as far as you could see, shivering on the cots, and many of them died. I was strong and healthy going in, so I didn't die, but I was sick as I've ever been. But I remember thinking, they're watching them, basically, this is unfair. When the UN tries to measure how much carbon each country in the world emits, the 140 million people in Bangladesh are a rounding error in the calculations, all right? Can't even really get a number. They don't, bicycle rickshaw is the main way that people get around if they're not walking. Most are not hooked up to the electric grid. Nobody's burning much fossil fuel, okay? The 4% of us who live in this country, because we've been burning fossil fuel for a long time and because the residence time of the CO2 molecule in the atmosphere is about 100 years, are currently responsible for close to 40% of the greenhouse gases warming the atmosphere, okay? That's the ethical problem. The deep practical problem is that we've only just begun this global warming story. I told you that so far we've warmed the atmosphere 1 degree, and that's caused the havoc that we've seen. The physicists and chemists are pretty convinced that there's another degree of warming in the pipeline already from carbon we've already emitted, because the heat is held in the oceans for a while before it's fully expressed into the atmosphere. So we're looking at probably another degree. But what the climatologists tell us with robust confidence now is that unless we get our act together very, very quickly, that 1 to 2 degrees will be, by century's end, at least 4 or 5 degrees. And if we don't, we have to make the shifts very quickly to avoid committing to that. You know, the next couple of decades are absolutely key. And the only way we will do it is to get off coal and gas and oil, and to do it far faster than any government is planning to do it at the moment, all right? That's the basic dilemma that we're in right now. We can't stop global warming, but we can keep it from getting worse only if we act, and we must act because there's no reason to think that civilization can deal with that magnitude of change. A couple of years ago, a team at University of Washington and Stanford agronomists issued a series of papers trying to figure out what would happen with temperature increases like that to our major grain crops. Without even going into the question of water availability or anything else, they said simply what happens when you take these crops that far out of the range at which they like to grow, because of course they evolved in the Holocene too. And what they concluded was that from this point in, every 1 degree Celsius rise in global average temperature should lead to roughly a 10% reduction in grain yields around the world. You guys know plenty about the world, enough to figure out that its current strains and stresses will not be helped if there are 20% fewer calories on the planet than there are now, all right? We're not going to be talking about development or progress or peace or stability or anything else. We're going to be talking about an endless series of emergency responses to trouble if we let that happen. We can't let that happen. And so that's what I want to talk about now, how we might be able to keep some of that from happening. And I'm not going to talk hardly at all about what you might think would be the sort of obvious thing to talk about, which is technology. I have no doubt the engineers will continue to do their job, as they already have. We now have many of the technologies that we need to begin addressing this problem in a tough way. The scientific method worked. That powerful scientific dialectic took a difficult problem in chemistry and physics and managed to crunch it successfully in a matter of a decade or two and give us a working consensus about what's coming. And the engineering method works. There are people hard at work figuring out all kinds of new ways to power our lives and things like that. As well as the scientific method has worked, that's how badly the political method has failed in this country and around the world, and that's what I want to talk about, because that's going to be the key to making any kind of real progress going forward. To say that it's failed is, in a sense, an understatement. We've had an unblemished, perfect, bipartisan 20-year record of accomplishing nothing in Washington on this problem, and it seems unlikely to end anytime really soon, frankly. And that's a huge problem, because unless we can effectively address the basic cornerstone of this issue, the fact that carbon doesn't carry any price that reflects the damage that it does in the atmosphere, we will never be able to pull the economic lever that's probably our best chance of swift and rapid action. It's taken me a while, longer than it should have, to kind of figure out what I think is going on and what the problem is. For 20 years, the basic idea has been we will have scientists talk calmly in the ear of our political leaders and explain to them that they are facing the worst problem that ever happened in the world and that they should do something about it. And that's what's happened. The part that we didn't figure out, I think, was that in the other ear of the politician, the fossil fuel industry was going to be bellowing threats, and that those bellowed threats would be more than enough to prevent action from happening. We're talking about the most profitable industry in the history of the world, by far. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money, all right? And all of you are well aware of the way that our political system works, enough to understand that money carries outsized influence and that blocking something from happening is the simplest thing in the world if you have a lot of money. And that's what's happened, all right? That, more than anything else, is what has prevented real action. There are other problems, all of our own inertia, and resistance to change and so on and so forth, and the fact that this is a global problem on a badly divided world. But at root, it's been the power of vested interest to prevent action that's been the problem. And at some point, that began to dawn on me, and it began to become clear to me that it was time to try different approaches, that it was time, as it were, to try and build a movement. Now, I don't know anything really about building movements. I'm a writer. Writers are self-selected to want to sit in their room and type. We're not good at public speaking and organizing and, all of that. But maybe it was when I got back from that trip to Bangladesh that it just at some point became unbearable to not try to do something more than write and speak. And that summer, I had no idea what to do, but I called up a few of my writer friends in Vermont and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to the steps of the federal building in Burlington. That's our major city, as you know, about 50,000 people, so it's not that major, but it's as good as we got. We're going to go sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll be arrested, and there'll be a little story in the paper, and at least we will have done something. And all these other writers were exactly as clueless as, oh, that's a good plan. Let's do that. One of them happily called up to the police in Burlington and said, what will happen if we carry out this intrepid stunt, And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you like, And so we had to recalibrate, and we sent out, I sent out email people saying we're going to go for a walk, and we left a couple of weeks later from Robert Frost's old summer writing cabin up in the Green Mountain. He's kind of our patron saint, and we walked for 5 days and slept in farm fields. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I'd sort of called the Methodist mafia en route to make sure that there would be potluck suppers, the sort of Methodist sacrament would be available, you know, as we walked. And we got to Burlington, there were 1,000 people marching, which in Vermont, I mean, you know, only UVM hockey games draw that many people at a time. So it was a big deal. And got all our politicians to come meet with us, and not only met with us, they signed this piece of paper saying that if they were elected, they'd work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050, which at the time was a very radical position. And yet they all signed, and not just Bernie Sanders, you know, the conservative Republicans, too. There was a woman running for Congress who almost won, Martha Rainville, the Adjutant General of our state National Guard. And she'd said 2 months before when she announced, she said, "I'm not sure climate change is real. More research needs to be done," which parenthetically, I believe at the moment would pass as a very progressive position within the Republican Party. But anyway, that's what she'd said. What turned out to be the more research that needed to be done was on the question, how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind? Because, empirically 1,000 was sufficient because she signed. That's the way it's supposed to work. We felt good. We felt good until the next morning when we opened up the newspaper and read a story saying this 1,000 people that we had gathered sort of spontaneously in Vermont probably represented the largest demonstration that had yet taken place in the United States about global warming. All right? We read that, we thought, no wonder we're getting nowhere. We've got the superstructure of a movement. We've got Al Gore, we've got scientists, we've got policy people, we've got engineers. We just forgot the movement part of the movement. There's nothing there to give it any heft, and can we produce some? And so we set to work, and by we, I mean me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury. They were seniors, so they weren't done with school, but they were done with school, more or less, and ready to go to work. And in January of 2008, we read this article. Jim Hansen at NASA, our foremost climatologist, and his team published an article that said, we finally know how much carbon in the atmosphere is too much. It said 350 parts per million, judging from paleo studies and from direct observation of things like Arctic melt. Any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than that is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Those of you who are used to reading scientific papers know that that is strong language indeed. And it's stronger language still when you know that outside today in the Berkshires and in Buenos Aires and in Bogota and in Beijing, the air is about 393 parts per million CO2. We're already way too high. That's why Vermont is drowning and Texas burning and the Arctic melting, okay? But it was a shock to read that in cold, hard type. The only thing about reading that kind of elated us in a sense was that it gave us a clue about how to go to work doing this global organizing that we had planned, because global organizing is a kind of foolhardy venture. Nobody really tries it, and not just because the globe is a big place, but because there's one real logistical problem. Everybody on the planet insists on speaking their own language, and it makes it incredibly hard to communicate things, all right? So it occurred to us that since Arabic numerals cross linguistic boundaries, maybe this wonky scientific data point, which you normally wouldn't choose to kind of try and rally people around, might actually be a kind of good idea. And so we formed this thing, 350.org. That was pretty much our only real advantage. We had no money, no organization. We did have 7 students, and 7 is a good number because there are 7 continents, so each one of them took one. And the one that took the Antarctic also had to take the internet because it's kind of its own, land mass. And so we set to work, and our work was just to find people like ourselves around the world. Now, most of the world, there's really not that much of a category called environmentalist, but every place there's people worried about food security, about war and peace, about women's issues, about development, about social justice, about all the things, public health, all the things that are undermined by a rapidly degrading planet. People concerned about, say, all the things that no one's working on in Pakistan this year because they're still trying to get tarps over people's heads, okay? And our idea, well, we did like training camps for young people like all over the world, one in Turkey for Central Asia, one in the Caribbean, one in Johannesburg. We brought down a couple of kids from almost every country in Africa. Most had never been on an airplane before or anything, but they're great and born organizers. And then everybody was just sort of fanning out around the world. We didn't know exactly, we weren't in great touch with them because you can't, large parts of the world, especially Africa, you can't just easily Skype all the time. The internet doesn't work that well, but we knew they were at work. And we told everybody we figured that the best thing we could do was take one day, and we picked almost at random October 24th, 2009. We said we'd take that as the day to try and introduce this number to the world, really try to push it into the information bloodstream of the planet. We didn't know how well this was going to work. We got the first sense it might work 2 days early on October 22nd. The 8 of us were sitting in a kind of borrowed, dingy office in Lower Manhattan, hunched around our laptops waiting for, doing press releases, but waiting for the first pictures to come in because we told everybody to upload images as soon as they had them. And on that day, 2 days early, we got a phone call. And it was from a 17-year-old girl in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, one of these young people that we trained a little bit in Africa. And she was almost in tears. And she says, Mr. Bill, the government took away our permit for Saturday. Ethiopia, not an especially nice government all the time. They took away our permit for Saturday, so we can't do it. We're doing it today so, people they can't stop us, but we're so sorry. And we don't want to jump the gun, and we don't want to spoil it for everybody. And we were so looking forward to doing it at the same time as everybody else. And there are 15,000 kids right now out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. And I was like, Lily, don't worry about the date. It's okay, And really, it was quite stunning for us, and the next 48 hours were just a period of almost unbelievable. We were in sort of tears of one kind or another most of the next 48 hours because these pictures just flowed in before the thing was over. That first weekend, there had been 5,100 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. And I'll just show you a couple of these pictures, a few of them real fast. I'm already running late, and I'm sorry here. The thing like some of them, the next one that came in was from U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. They make a 350 with sandbags and send a note saying, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, And then just sort of around the globe, sort of as the sun goes, they begin to come. But here's the thing I want you to notice, okay? You may have heard, as I have heard from time to time over the years, this trope that environmentalism is something for rich white people who have taken care of their other problems, and that people who have to put bread on the table every day couldn't be expected to worry about such a thing. And it just turns out that that's wrong. It's hogwash. Most of the people that we work with around the world are poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. And oddly enough, they're just as interested in the future as anybody else. Maybe more so, because if you're in those categories, the future is currently bearing down harder on you, all right? And so it was really powerful. We were getting pictures from places we'd never heard of. 300 big demonstrations across India. That's the India Youth Climate Network in Calcutta. Places we couldn't identify. Someplace in Buddhist Asia, but it's just a great picture, Incredibly poor places. These are dugout canoes someplace on the Congo River above Kinshasa. They didn't have a digital camera. They had an old-fashioned camera. They tried to develop it in a home darkroom. It didn't come out that well, so they wrote in what their banner had said, before that. But it moved me to no end just to sort of see these kind of things streaming in from all over the planet. Big, Istanbul, it had bad flooding, so there's one of the 6 big university rallies that was going on there. Lots of creativity, and that's from the Space Needle. That's the colors of the Venezuelan flag. That's an operating room. Hopefully they didn't stop for too long. Amazing wonderful pictures coming from all over the world, huge involvement by religious leaders. There's the head of Muslim South Africa, indigenous traditions next to him, and behind him in the scarlet, Archbishop Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop at the head of a huge multi-faith march, you know. There's Billy Graham's alma mater, the most important evangelical liberal arts college in the country. I'd been to Bethlehem to organize, hard place to get to do this kind of work. The Dead Sea is shrinking very quickly as the planet warms, and so people wanted to do something. They couldn't cross all the military checkpoints, so the Jordanians said, we'll make the 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we'll do the 0. It was a beautiful, powerful thing to see, people putting aside their other issues to deal with the bottom line issues that we face. Lots of that global scrabble. It was an autumn Saturday in the U.S., so, you know, we needed like the Syracuse cheerleaders and things to help us, but just, you know, just endless number of these pictures coming in from every corner of the planet. Soweto, heartland of resistance to apartheid, they did 350 bungee jumps, but the important thing was that they strung the bungee cord between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant and sent us a note saying, here's the highest and best use for coal-fired power plants going forward, you know. It's my daughter in there someplace with sap buckets because our maple trees may not do well. China, not an easy place to do this sort of thing, but there were 300 big demonstrations there. One got broken up by the police, the others went ahead. That's the China Youth Climate Network, and behind them, the biggest wind farm in the world. Just magnificent, magnificent. There's our friends in the Maldives, one of the great countries in the world, and a place that probably won't be there, though its culture stretches back 5,000 years. The highest point on the island is about, the islands is about 1 meter above sea level, so their odds of surviving the century are small. It was a great day. It got enormous attention, the sort of lead story in Google News for 36 hours, and I think the reason was because so many of the people who were participating did not look like what editors thought environmentalists should look like, you know? The 0 there is all women in full black burqa, okay? Here's the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi. You can see some oil-rich sheikhs in their dish dashes down front. But these are wiser oil-rich sheikhs than our own variety, because you'll also see behind them what they've invested some of their riches in. That's the largest solar array on the planet. Abu Dhabi is the new home of the UN Renewable Energy Program. Place after place after place. And there were, I'm afraid, 600 or 700 photos that just went in a file called 350 Adorable. And they really were adorable. That look on that girl in the middle just kills me every time I look at it. Partly because, you know, chances are she's a refugee by the time she's old enough to have kids herself, and through absolutely no fault of her own, okay? Now, I wish I could tell you that all of this amazing commotion had saved the day. We did all right. We got to that big Copenhagen conference a couple of weeks later, 6 weeks later, and we managed to convince 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target. So we figured that's good, you know, 8 of us in 18 months, you know, managing to find enough people in the world that we could, you know, 117 nations, except they were the wrong 117 nations. There were all the poor and vulnerable ones, and all the rich addicts, led by us, refused to do a thing, and so the movie did not end as it was supposed to end, and the talks collapsed in a fizzle, and 6 months later, the U.S. Senate, then with 60 Democrats in it, refused to even take a vote on the most modest, tepid, tame climate bill you could imagine. They were so terrified of the fossil fuel industry, they would not even take a vote. And I figured this would be enough to kill off this nascent movement in the cradle, but happily, people elsewhere were made of sterner stuff than I am. We did the same thing last fall. This time we called it a global work party, and people were putting up solar panels and digging community gardens and laying out bike paths, and at the end they were picking up their phone and calling their leaders and just saying, I'm getting to work, what about you? It was a good day, and it had 7,400 of these events in every country on earth except North Korea, okay? It's really powerful. And we'll keep doing this. In fact, the next one of these big days of global solidarity is coming up this weekend And here in Williamstown, actually, you're going to jump the gun by a day and have a sort of bicycle assembly between 3:30 and 5 at the elementary school on Friday afternoon. And it'll be all about bikes, and indeed, that's what much of the stuff going on this year around the world is about. We're calling the day Moving Planet, and there'll be bicycles everywhere because A, bicycles are an important part of the solution that we face, elegant form of technology that we need to make far more use of, and B, because bicycles are fun and everybody sort of smiles when they see them and kind of recognizes that the world that's coming could be kind of sweet in certain ways, and C, because bicycles are one of the very few tools that both rich people and poor people around this world use, and so it is a very good chance to demonstrate that kind of solidarity that we need. So it'll be a beautiful day. And all the kind of things that we're doing, you know, the same cool group here in Williamstown is doing energy assessments and that kind of thing at the moment. You can find out all about it on their table back there. All that kind of stuff's really important, and we got to keep doing it, and it's not going to be enough. Okay, we also, I'm afraid, have to pick up our game further and become more aggressive and more confrontational, and I do not say that easily because I am, you know, a Methodist Sunday school teacher. That's kind of my personality. But since we cannot match the oil industry for money, we're going to have to figure out other currencies to work in. And sometimes those are our passion and spirit and creativity, like they will be this weekend with this Moving Planet thing, and sometimes there are bodies. That's what it was the last few weeks in Washington, and I'll just tell you that story briefly, even though I'm rattling on past the time I should have. I'll just, for a second more, tell you this story. This thing that we were protesting, is a pipeline that's going to run, if it's built, from the tar sands of Alberta down to the Gulf of Mexico. And it's something we should have all figured out how to oppose years ago, because the damage that it's doing is enormous to the landscape that it's in. They've already moved more earth than they moved building the Great Wall of China and the Suez Canal and the 10 biggest dams in the world, okay? And they've wrecked the landscape where native people lived for a very long time. And those native people made a squawk about it, but the rest of us, me at least, didn't really hear and pay that much attention, because there's always 1,000 horrible things going on in the world, and how do you kind of know which one to deal with? But earlier this year, that same NASA team, Jim Hansen and company, published a paper attempting to calculate how much carbon was up in those tar sands that we were now starting to try to really exploit in a big way. So far, even with moving all that earth, they've only gotten about 3% of the oil out of it. What they said was that it's the second biggest pool of carbon on earth after the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. Now, it was burning the oil fields of Saudi Arabia more than anything else that increased our temperature a degree so far, you know. When we found the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, we didn't know about global warming, so no moral opprobrium attaches to us for burning it. But now that we do, if we find the next Saudi Arabia and just do the same thing, then we are fools and worse, you know. They calculated that if you could somehow burn, and you happily can't overnight, but if you somehow overnight could burn all the oil in those Canadian fields, you'd run the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide from its current 393 parts per million to about 550 parts per million, okay? As Hansen said, if you add this to the mix of coal and everything else we're already burning, it is, and here I quote, essentially game over for the climate, okay? Having read that, that got my attention. And we began reaching out to the native groups that had been running this work, and to all the people along the pipeline route who were rightly worried that it was a poor idea to run a huge pipeline over the Oglala Aquifer and things like that, and added this other global dimension to it, this worry about, and I, along with Wendell Berry, who was here a couple of years ago and who I hope some of you had the opportunity to hear when he was, one of my great heroes in the world, the greatest writer at work in our language, I think. He and I and a couple others sent out a letter to people just saying, you know what, come to Washington at the end of August and we're going to have you sit down in front of the White House and get arrested. Because Barack Obama, for once, gets to make this call all by himself. He has to sign or not sign a presidential certificate of the national interest before they can build this pipeline. And if he doesn't sign it, they can't build it. So for once, our inane Congress is not in the way, you know, and he could do the right thing. And yet, of course, the pressure from the oil industry is unbelievable. And they think they have it completely wired. They've done all the things you're supposed to do in Washington. They spent millions of dollars lobbying. They hired Hillary Clinton's old deputy campaign manager as their chief lobbyist. Not, I'm guessing, because of his deep knowledge of pipelines, you know. And so this was kind of a last-ditch effort. And we didn't know what would happen. And what happened was that 1,253 people showed up over these 2 weeks to get arrested. It was the biggest civil disobedience action in this country for at least 30 years, okay? And there are people in this room, and I'm looking at Sam right now, who showed up to help with this work and make it happen. And in fact, he was not all that unusual in his age. We had told people we didn't think college students should have to be the cannon fodder for this work. A, because, you know, the rest of us have spent our lives pouring carbon into the atmosphere. And B, because, you know, given our current economy and things, perhaps an arrest record for a, 19-year-old isn't the single wisest thing in the whole world. Once you've reached a certain age, however, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? So that's sort of what happened. I thought it'd be rude to ask people how old they were, so we asked them who was president when they were born. And the two biggest cohorts of people who were arrested came from the FDR and the Truman years, okay? On the last day, there was an 86-year-old guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He'd been born in the Harding administration, okay? So it was quite stunning. Not the usual suspects and not the usual attitude exactly. Most people were wearing a necktie or dress when they got arrested, and the reason was that I really wanted to demonstrate to everybody who the radicals in this scenario are, and they're not us, okay? Radicals are people who run Exxon. Radicals are people who go to work at Goldman Sachs and figure out how to finance new coal mines. These are people who are willing, eager, to alter the atmospheric composition of to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere, you know? That's the most radical thing that anyone's ever thought of doing. Those of you who are old enough to remember the 60s will remember that Abby Hoffman managed to freak out everybody by threatening to dump LSD in the reservoir of one city, you know, and this was a huge, well, I mean, what a piker, you know. Exxon is happy to chemically alter the entire atmosphere for all time, and, you know, simply so it can keep making the money it's making for a couple more years. That was the point we wanted to get across. The effect of doing this was that we managed to take a regional issue and make it a national one, that we managed to make it clear that Barack Obama has the power to stop this if he wants to, and that it is the central environmental test for him between now and the next election. And we're people used their bodies, I guess, to kind of ante us into the game. And now we've got to play the game over the next 90 days, because in that period is when the president has said he will make his decision. And so spontaneously, in the days since, every place the president has gone on college campuses and things to campaign, big demonstrations have erupted of people in a kind of friendly but firm way, you know, showing up, and the chant that's kind of going around is, yes, we can stop the pipeline, you know. And there'll be a lot of organized visits to his various campaign offices around the country with lots of people going in and saying, we worked for you last time, and you know, we need you to keep your word. Because this is a guy who said when he was campaigning, on the night he was nominated, he said, if I'm in my administration, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow and the planet will begin to heal. Okay? Shouldn't say stuff like that if you don't mean it, because people are apt to believe you. And yes, Congress has been in the way a lot, but it's not in the way here. This actually hasn't been officially announced, but it will be in the next couple of days. So I will trust you guys with the information. The final big play of this is going to come on November 6th, which is exactly 1 year before the election, and it is a Sunday. And that day we're going to try to get enough people in Washington to do something that I don't think anyone's ever done before, which is encircle the whole White House in people. Now, it's going to take quite a few people because, there's a wide security perimeter around the White House. So I don't know if we can get enough, and it's not illegal. We're not going to get people arrested. And it's not even going to be particularly angry if I have anything to do about it. The mood is more all about, we need you to do the thing you said you're going to do. And so we need you to figure out, as we do people all over this part of the world, how you're going to charter a couple of buses and get down there to help us, okay? To be in that circle and to be, it's not that we're going to solve global warming by stopping this pipeline, but moments emerge in movements unexpectedly, where you can make a stand and make a difference, and if we win this fight, then the momentum around this politics will change a little bit. So I hope you'll join us. I hope you'll go to tarsandsaction.org and figure it all out. I'm going to end just by saying, because I'm more a writer than an organizer and hence have to be honest all the time, I'll end by saying, I'm not sure any of this is going to work, okay? There are scientists who think we've waited too long to get started and that the momentum of this heating is irreversible, and there are political scientists who think the odds are too high. That there's just too much money on the other side to allow for quick shift. And they may be right. If you were a betting person, you would be wise to bet that way because we've been losing for 20 years. But it's not really a bet you're allowed to make. The only response for a moral human being, when the worst thing that ever happened in the world is happening, is to try and figure out how to change the odds of that wager a little bit with not any assurance at all that it's going to come out okay. Just to try and figure out how to change the odds some. All right? I can't guarantee you we're going to win. I can absolutely guarantee you, because I've spent the last few years in motion around the earth with an enormous carbon footprint, meeting with people in rooms like this one. And it's always a great honor. It's a great honor especially in those countries where people have done nothing to cause the problem. And yet they are willing to work with those of us who have, in solidarity and in connection. That always blows my mind. I think if I were a Bangladeshi, I might just, if some Westerner showed up to I might just sort of shake my fist at him and say, go away, you've caused enough trouble already, But people are better than that. It's always an honor to be in those rooms, and it's an honor to be in this room. And I don't know if we're going to win, but I do know that, it'll be really good to just fight shoulder to shoulder as long as we can and as long as it takes. Thank you all very much. Thank you all enormously. Thank you all. Thank you all. Now, I've talked on so long that I ate into some of the time we were supposed to use for answering questions. That was just, I know that you're a smart bunch, and I wanted to filibuster any of the hard questions, But we have a little time left, yes? So fire away, and I'll repeat them. And if you need to go, don't worry about being impolite. But I'll repeat them so people can hear them. But just shout them out so I can hear them well.
Corporate charter reform. Do you think there's anything there that could be helpful?
Corporate charter reform. This is this effort in it to take away, to allow. When corporations began in this country, they were chartered by states, and it was a big deal. And you had to get a corporate charter that said you were going to work to help the world, and do the series of things you were planning to do and all of that. And they could be revoked if you did bad stuff, all right? That doesn't happen anymore. It's become sort of matter of both custom and law not to revoke charters, even when companies do almost unbelievable things. In fact, in recent years, it's become the practice, if they do things bad enough, to award them enormous sums of money so they can continue doing them, So it would be a good thing to, frankly, if we could figure out how to get corporate charter reform and toss a scare into companies. The legal fiction that companies are people, okay, and have the rights of people is a particular problem, especially if those people never die, okay? If there's no possibility of them ever dying, then there's very little hindrance on their behavior. So charter reform, in essence, is an ability to allow the occasional particularly sick corporation to expire, and it probably would be a salutary thing. So I hope that people continue work on that.
Do you think we could make the tar sands issue the pivotal campaign issue in the coming election? There are so many people that are very discouraged about Obama. And if we could, is that possible?
So, Elizabeth, it's a very good question. I don't think it's going to become the pivotal issue. This election will be fought on jobs above all else, okay? But yeah, and you can make it some of that. But but it can be a very important issue, and here's how. What we need the administration to understand, I think, is not that people are necessarily going to go vote for Rick Perry instead of Obama if he doesn't do the right thing on the tar sands, okay? That's a stretch. But what will happen is that there will not be the kind of surge of enthusiasm and support, especially among young people, that made it possible for Barack Obama to kind of beat the historical odds and win that last election. Look, I know more about physical nature than human nature. I know when you pour carbon into the atmosphere you get, but I'm a good enough student of human nature just to know that the kind of discouragement that will come with him doing the wrong thing here will depress that base. And what we're trying to do in a kind of odd way is set it up, not attacking him and not saying you're a sellout and we want nothing to do, setting it up so that if he does the right thing, there's some possibility of it kind of igniting that base again. One of the most moving things to watch when we were down in those protests was that there were a number of young people appeared. A bunch of old people got arrested, but young people have been the heart of this movement here and around the world, okay? A number of young people showed up who had held high positions in the Obama campaign, because it was in certain ways a children's crusade, There was a young woman who had been his Florida director of operations, and then went to work in the administration. Wonderful young woman. And she had the guts to come get arrested. Even though everybody in the administration getting emails from people and so on and so forth saying, it's the equivalent of you'll never work in this town again, and so on and so forth. That was a brassy thing to do, and good for her. And, that kind of message penetrates. It will penetrate enormously if there are, 3 busloads from Williams College of the kind of kids who went out and worked for President Obama last time, and this time they're there, and in jacket and tie, if you all can manage that, just saying, we want you to do the right thing. We're not making threats and we're not making promises. We want you to do the right thing. That'll be a powerful and noticed moment, and it'll have some possibility of really shifting. And no guarantees, because the other side is unbelievably strong. But there's a couple of good signs happening already. One of the best ones was last week in that very red state, Nebraska, where this pipeline is going to run through. People have done a terrific job organizing opposition to it, because the chances of a disastrous pipeline leak in the sand hills or over the Ogallala Aquifer are large, okay? And last week, TransCanada Pipeline, the company that's actually building the thing, during the Nebraska Cornhuskers football game, they ran an ad on the Jumbotron in halftime. And apparently half the stadium there in Lincoln, Nebraska stood up and booed. And the next day, the university announced that they were severing their contract with, giving back the money to TransCanada that they'd taken to be their sponsor. And that's a kind of good sign. And today, I got an email from my friends in the Native communities saying that they'd had a big meeting at the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in the Dakotas yesterday, and representatives from most of the Indian nations on both sides of the border had come together with a really strong statement against and promised to oppose in every way this pipeline, which is a big deal because the oil industry's been really good at sort of picking off, poor and tribes and things over the years and things like that. There are signs that people are beginning to, and my favorite, I wrote this letter that'll go out in a couple of days that you guys will get, and one of the people I wanted to sign, it was a guy you might have heard of, some of you, a guy named Tim DeChristopher, who was arrested in a really wonderful act of civil disobedience a couple of years ago in Utah. Young guy, and he went into one of these BLM, Bureau of Land Management auctions for oil and gas leases in pristine parts of the West, and these things that pour a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. He just went in and sat down, and he started bidding on all these oil and gas allotments, and he won a whole bunch of them, and the federal government was so mad that he had done this that they've put him away for 2 years in prison. But we managed to get a note into him in prison, and he, sent right back saying, "Yep, put me." So this letter that's going out from me and a couple other people, the first name on it says Tim DeChristopher, inmate, Federal Correctional Institution, Herlong, California. And the other name at the bottom of the list, and a guy who I spent 3 days in jail with in Washington, is a guy named Gus Speth, who was the absolute establishment environmentalist of all time. He founded the Natural Resources Defense Council. He was the first chairman under President Carter of the President's Council on Environmental Quality. He ran the UN Development Program. He was a dean at Yale. He's now a professor at Vermont Law School in his retirement. And he and I were in adjoining cells. And at one point he said to me through the bars, said, "You know what? I've held a lot of important positions in this town over the years, but none of them seemed as necessary as this one." That's the kind of spirit people have realized that the time has come to act, and if you're going to act, you might as well do it now. There's no point in sort of holding back for a few years and seeing if things get really bad. Things are getting really bad with climate change, and our only chance of doing something about it is to do something about it soon. And hence this, I wish I could tell you all you could wait 4 years and get through college and do your thing then, but you can't. If you want to do something about it, now's the time. And I guess now's the time to end. No, I have one more? Good. All right. Yes?
Okay, so I see why you say what you say about Congress and the potential to get Obama to act being more likely. I don't know if you remember what happened at the beginning of the power shift in the spring, but in terms of direct action we can take in Congress, what are your thoughts on the future?
So direct action one could take at Congress and what we can do. We got to keep doing all the things that we do, but frankly, right now, Congress isn't going to do anything for, certainly not with the current composition of Congress. We have a large number of people who have decided to substitute ideology for chemistry and physics, all right? And that's a huge problem. And so the only way to cure that is to replace them. And that's going to be hard to do, thanks to Citizens United, that Supreme Court decision that lets corporations spend as much money as they want on campaigns, and it turns out as much as they want is a lot, So it's going to take a lot of battles. I mean, you'll have a good one here in Massachusetts in Senate campaign in the fall and things like that. But so for the moment, we got to pick our targets where we can find them and take the emphasis we can. It's no use fighting Pyrrhic battles that you have no chance of winning, but it is worthwhile sort of strengthening your champions and trying to find avenues in which to work. Here's the thing. We're going to continue to have openings for change. This isn't hopeless, and the reason is a sad one. The natural world is going to continue to give us one teachable moment after another, okay? The good people of Binghamton, New York, have a much deeper understanding of climate change now than they did 2 weeks ago. And that's a sad thing, but it's a true one, okay? And sooner or later, we're going to do the right thing. The trouble is, sooner or later is the real question here. Martin Luther King and the people in the civil rights movement, who had to be far braver than, any Oscar, no one's going to shoot you for talking about climate change. But they did have the kind of sure knowledge that they were going to win in the end. Dr. King ended every speech he gave almost by quoting from Lowell. He said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." We're going to win in the end. The arc of the physical universe appears to be short and to bend towards heat, and hence we're going to either win this soon or we're not going to win it. And I guess that's, if you detect a certain urgency in my voice, that's the urgency. And I hope that you guys feel it too. And in some ways, I hope that those of you who are students feel it even more strongly, because I've got, knock on wood, another 25 years or so on this planet, but you've got another 60, 70, okay? And it behooves you, for practical reasons and the ethical ones we talked about, to make sure that the planet that you're going to inhabit is a planet that has some hope of being the kind of just and verdant place that we all want it to be. And we'll find out if we can still do that. It's no guarantee, but there's a certain guarantee that if we do not work hard together, the chances are nil. And that's the urgency, and that's the opportunity. And it really is an opportunity, too. I got to talk every morning to those people before they went off to get arrested, 100 or so a day. And two things I said every morning were, one, this is not easy for any of you, because it's not easy for normal people to go do something a policeman tells them not to do, and to get handcuffed and put in a paddy wagon and all of that. It's not easy, okay? But the second thing I told them was, very few people in this world ever get the chance to say, right now, at this moment, I'm doing the most important thing I could possibly be doing, all right? That's not something that most people ever get to do. That's something you'll get to do if you show up on November 6th to help with this thing, and I hope I see a bunch of you there, and thank you all very, very much.